They heard the approach of whining gears and assumed it was the recon's armoured car. Instead, 2 flatbed trucks loaded with Japanese troops casually drove into our perimeter and a few seconds later drove out the opposite side. Not a shot was fired. The Japanese didn't even realize we were here. 2 minutes later, a long column of enemy soldiers on foot followed the trucks. Our gunners were finally alert. It was their firing that you heard. It's quieted down now, but I'm told the road is littered with enemy bodies. At daylight, I want you to leave the trucks and supplies in charge of the motor pool. Follow our trail through the bush with all men that can be spared. He hesitated. What a damned foul-up. I hope no one hears of this. Before full dawn, I was on my way to join the battalion. Just as I reached them, a patrol came in with a few enemy wounded. One shirtless Japanese soldier had a shiny .30 caliber bullet protruding from his shoulder. It looked loose, so I attempted to pluck it out. He flinched and gave me a dirty look. At that moment, Mac spotted me. "Chuck, bring that Japanese over here. We've got an interpreter." I leaned over the seated soldier, spoke to him, and beckoned for him to get up. He ignored me. Our A&P, ammunition and pioneer officer, a big bruiser, became impatient and kicked the enemy soldier in the rear. The Japanese turned angrily and said in perfect English, "What's the matter?" I laughed and called back to Mac, "We don't need an interpreter for this one." The prisoner admitted to being a pilot at the Japanese airfield, but wouldn't tell us where he had learned his perfect English. I suspect he was a transplant from California. I often thought about the consequences if anyone had fired at the trucks while they were in the centre of the battalion. What a Donnybrook that would have been, with about 70 armed Japanese soldiers dumped into the middle of the pot. Finally, Easy covered us, and a carrying party arrived with a litter. I was thankful that our battalion surgeon, Nathan Somberg, had given us instruction on how to treat wounds. He had said, "Don't let internal organs dry for even a second." Many days later, Salvador and I were able to go back to Dumaguete to clean up and check the men in the hospital. Paul Wright was in a separate room. When I opened the door, he saw me and began shouting curse after curse at me. I quietly closed the door, knowing he must be suffering horribly. At least he was alive and never appeared on later casualty lists. Salvador asked me if I would like to see the library at Silliman University, where Japanese Colonel Oye, pronounced OEI, kept all prisoners until their execution. Entering the thick, stone-walled building, I was horrified. The inside walls of the large library, perhaps 30 by 60 feet, were whitewashed, but every inch, as high as a man could reach, even while resting upon the shoulders of another, was covered with writing. Much of the writing was done using blood for ink, the prisoners lacking pencils and pens. Last wills and testaments, calendars showing the names of men and their execution dates, littered every wall. Hardly a square foot was left for writing. There were hundreds of names on the walls, all to be executed by Colonel Oye. Outside, Salvador led me to the sea wall, where the Japanese cut off the heads of the prisoners, after tying their hands behind their backs and making them kneel with their heads forward. Their bodies were then thrown in the water, disposed of by fish and sharks. Afterward, Salvador took me to a friend's home where secret photos had been taken of many of the executions from the second floor of an adjoining building. One clear photo was of an Australian pilot, still in uniform, kneeling with his head bared, his hands tied behind him. A Japanese officer, his sabre raised overhead, was about to behead him. I reported this building, requesting that the walls be photographed by intelligence to confirm identification of the men. I doubt it was ever done, I just don't know. I actually blinked back tears when I left the library, my hatred of the Japanese renewed, especially for Colonel Oye. I found out later that it was doubtful he was ever tried for war crimes. The name Oye means big house. Supposedly, he was an important man in Japan prior to and during the war. While we stopped to bathe in a stream, we watched a Filipino man sneaking cautiously along the shore, plucking the large banana flowers from plants. Salvador yelled, and the man ran. Salvador explained, "It's against the law to remove the flowers. They bake up into a delicious meal, but there will be no fruit on the tree. Our return trip up to the battalion was a cinch, a journey of 12 miles and a climb to 4,000 feet, all by jeep. While travelling, Salvador told me a little of his association with the Japanese. He had joined the Filipino guerrillas while still going to school. They harassed the enemy from time to time, keeping them bottled up in the areas between Dumaguete and Bias. Unfortunately, the guerrillas were not a formidable force, being poorly trained and led by local politicians. They were easily pushed back by the Japanese forces. Salvador had slipped into Dumaguete at night to visit friends and had been caught at daybreak by the Japanese auxiliary police. These were Filipino collaborators recruited by the Japanese for favors and money. He was confined at the Silliman Library to be executed, but it seemed a Japanese officer wanted his sister. To save his life, she moved in with this collaborator. Upon our landing at Dumaguete on Negros, the guerrillas rounded up these traitors, putting them in the local prison. This Japanese and Salvador's sister were both locked up there. I told Mac the story, so when he went into Dumaguete, he took Salvador to the prison. It was a tearful reunion for them both. She was pregnant. One of our battalions came across about 75 civilians who had gone into the hills with the Japanese. They were collaborators expecting succor from their former friends. The Japanese were soon short of food and finally refused to feed them. Ordered to return to Dumaguete by the Japanese, some refused, so the Japanese raked them with Nambu fire, wounding several. That convinced them. They were forced to walk the 12 miles back to the city. Fighting near the entrance to a cave, one soldier found $999 in $1 bills while searching a dead Japanese. I was informed this cavity contained large amounts of explosives stored there by the enemy. They were removed by Easy Company. Now we had overrun them. Our new officer replacements for Easy Company were now in the thick of the fighting. On April 25th, our unit sailed from Cebu City on LCIs, and on April 26th, waded ashore at Dumaguete, Negros Island. My company commander was now First Lieutenant Clayton Kingston. Whenever my platoon was the lead platoon on our march inland, and Lieutenant Kingston was walking beside me, he gave advice and moral support for a new officer in a combat position. I always admired him for that. The second night on the island, the Japanese patrols harried us at night by throwing grenades at our foxholes. One landed on the dirt pile I had made from digging it, but I suffered only hearing loss for a while. We continued to follow the enemy as they retreated to the high mountains in the interior of Negros Island. At night, the enemy would check out our positions. The company adopted the policy that after dark no one was to leave his foxhole or they could be shot. After pursuing the enemy further and higher up in the mountains, the colonel assigned me the task of a flanking maneuver. My third platoon was given one light machine gun crew and one 60 mm mortar to make up a reinforced rifle platoon. We were trucked several miles around the end of a large mountain where we met two Filipino guides. We unloaded. We walked several miles to a point on the opposite side of the mountain from our troops. Here, I was introduced to a Major Dumanado, a Filipino in charge of some Filipino resistance fighters. He seemed more content to discuss American history than to run the Japanese off the mountain. The only way up to the top of this mountain was a very narrow trail up the hogback, with sides that dropped off almost vertically. We knew from the Filipino troops that the Japanese had a machine gun guarding the trail. In a day or two, I took a squad of men and attempted to assault the Japanese position. A single shot was fired at the lead man, but it missed. Needless to say, we fell back to a safe distance. We had a second lieutenant observer from headquarters observing the action. I said it was kamikaze to send men up again, as we know there is a machine gun guarding the trail. The lieutenant observer said to me, "You're not going to let one shot keep you from going up the hill, are you?" I said to him, "Do you want to lead the way?" His reply was, "That's not my job." I conferred with my veteran soldier, Staff Sergeant Bill Bailey, and he suggested we lay flat on the ground with 2 BRs and M1S and lay a lot of fire up the trail. When we did this, the Japanese machine gun opened up full blast, and the bullets were just a few feet over our heads. I turned to the observer and said, "Now, do you think we can go up the trail?" He replied, "No, it isn't possible without a heavy loss of life." I thanked Sergeant Bailey for his combat knowledge of the situation. The next day, 4 P-38s flew over the area, but they came nowhere near hitting the target area. A few days later, my unit was called back to rejoin our company on the other side of the mountain. On June 5th, I was promoted to first lieutenant. After my 3rd platoon rejoined the company, we proceeded to pursue the Japanese farther up the mountain. We were to attack Japanese positions about and above our present location. I was ordered to scout the approach using 1 squad of men, plus my platoon Sergeant Bill Bailey. We carried an SCR 300 radio on this patrol. My lead scout became intimidated when a Japanese threw a grenade at him and disappeared into the jungle-like brush. He was already on orders for rotation, and he said he could not do the job properly. Sergeant Bailey immediately said, "I'll take lead scout." Down in the deep valley or ravine, we came across a lot of Japanese communication wire and stopped to examine it. Bailey said to me, "I sure don't like the looks of this. We better work this area over with mortars." I reported what we had found on the radio to my CO. I said, "What do you want me to do?" Kingston said, "Keep going, but watch your step. We just saw some Japanese up above you in the same rocks." We started to go farther, and instantly 2 large explosions went off exactly where we were. My 2 scouts, Kappa and Bailey, were in front of me. My squad sergeant behind me was killed almost instantly. My barman had a big hole in his forehead. The Filipino boy who was carrying my radio threw it away and ran to the rear, as did the remaining men in the squad. To show what army training will do, we were always taught never to abandon our weapon, so I picked up the bar, rifle and radio and headed back for help. At the time, the Japanese started raking the area with machine gun fire. Fortunately, they could not get the fire low enough, as it was just above my head. I got about 100 feet back when I heard a noise in the brush to my left. I checked it out, and it turned out to be my 2nd scout, Kappa. I said, "Where's Bailey?" He said, "He is dead." We returned to the company area and reported. Needless to say, we had to recover our dead and wounded. Lieutenant Kingston, the CO, called artillery and asked for smoke on the Japanese positions. They said, "We only have 25 rounds, so you will have to hurry." Needless to say, we did. When we got to the wounded man, he was conscious but had a large hole in his forehead and said he couldn't see. He was able to walk out with help. I never heard from him after that. I promoted PFC Kappa to sergeant. The worst loss to me was Sergeant Bailey. His help to me in making decisions was almost impossible to replace. His courage in volunteering to take lead scout was remarkable. I will always be indebted to him for all my life. After the recovery of the dead and wounded, the artillery pounded that position all night. The next day, when we climbed the mountain peak, there was not a tree standing and no Japanese to be found. Too bad we didn't shell it before I had 2 good men killed and 1 wounded. A few weeks later, the whole regiment withdrew from the hills and were transported back to Cebu Island in the vicinity of Cebu City. Here we were issued new clothes and other necessities for personal use. I received new replacement personnel to bring the platoon up to regulation strength. Next, we started amphibious training in LCVPs in preparation for the assault on southern Japan. Thank God Harry Truman had the guts to drop the bomb, thus saving thousands of lives. I went back to the airfield to catch a ride in an L4 with Lieutenant Mitchell, a pilot of the 245th Field Artillery. He was to show me some of the major Japanese defensive positions. A separate landing strip had been cleared by the engineers for our small aircraft. This was a stupid waste of time. Although the blacktop main Japanese runway was mined, 1 hour of work would have cleared all the explosives. I walked a short distance along the blacktop strip to find small circular holes had been systematically dug, with a 75 mm artillery shell buried nose up in each hole. A small board had been placed over each detonator to be pressed down by the wheels of a landing aircraft. To defuse this minefield was easy. Remove the board and unscrew, counterclockwise, the detonator from the shell. It was perfectly safe. A child could do it if shown how. I had a few minutes before Mitchell finally arrived, so I disarmed several, unfortunately not nearly enough. We had to remove the 612 radio in the L4 to compensate for my weight, since these L4S had little horsepower, I believe only 65. We flew up to our battalion, then farther up the ridge, where I saw many defensive holes dug by the enemy. All were located to cover large expanses of open mountain. One Japanese soldier ducked into a hole on the top of the ridge. Mitchell reached for a grenade from the small rack on the right overhead. Diving on the enemy, he missed the Japanese by a country mile. I could see why both of our L4S had so many bullet patches on them. Any good rifleman should have been able to shoot them down. Still, many Japanese held off shooting at the small craft, knowing they could expect immediate artillery retaliation. Upon completion of our search, Mitchell decided to buzz the battalion to give me a thrill. He did, but for this stunt, he got a tongue lashing from his CO. On another occasion, Lieutenant Lin, our other pilot, took me up as the battalion progressed farther up the mountain. He and Mitchell had a tent on the airfield with canvas bunks. Mitchell had a pet monkey on a chain tied to his bed. Lin told me, "That damned monkey jumped over and pissed all over my cot. When Mitchell was gone, I took the critter for a ride. I had a hellish time dropping him from the plane. He was all over me." To protect the waterfront of Dumaguete, the Japanese had placed drums of alcohol along the beaches and seawalls. If we had landed at the city's edge, machine gun fire with tracer bullets would supposedly have punctured the drums, setting them on fire. Upon our assault landing, those troops entering the city from the north thought it strange when they saw Filipinos busy rolling the black barrels to their homes. Soon after that, several homes opened bars. One afternoon, about 3 p.m., Mac received a call ordering us to march back downhill and load up on trucks to pass back to Dumaguete, then go up the Dumaguete Valley to a position directly across from our present location. This meant abandoning our positions to the Japanese, which was utterly stupid. Using field glasses, we could see across the valley to the north. It was open country, devoid of enemy. Mac questioned the regimental executive, the one I had the encounter with about firing the 37mm gun on Bougainville, to find our regimental commander was thoroughly drunk, another of the great school on the Hudson graduates. I had to give Mac credit as I heard the entire conversation. "Don't you have any say? Don't you have any guts? If he's as drunk as you say, cancel the order. We all know he's nothing but a damned rum-dum." Our cowardly regimental exec, afraid for his job, refused. We spent the remainder of the day and most of the night retreating the 12 miles back to Dumaguete, then crossing to the other side of Dumaguete Valley. At noon the next day, the regimental CO sobered up and moved us back to our old positions. The Japanese had moved in, as we knew they would. We lost more men killed and wounded retaking our old holes. Mac and I filed charges against the CO, sending the letter up through to division. From there it was to go to the Inspector General's department in Washington, D.C. A few days later, we heard the letter was opened by the CO at division, who said to his cronies, "We can't let poor Jiggs be railroaded by that National Guard bunch." This came back to us as gospel, since the conversation was overheard. Jiggs was the West Point nickname of our regimental CO. In an effort to soften up the Japanese positions, a tactical air control party was sent up to us. This captain and his driver had a jeep loaded with radios to direct aircraft when bombing or dispersing napalm in close cooperation with troops. A bombing raid on the ridges was staged, followed a day or two later with a napalm attack. We moved farther up, reaching 4,400 feet before again being stopped. In one of his artillery shoots, Mitchell was directing fire from his L4. Getting too close to the explosion's shrapnel took a chunk off his propeller, but he was lucky. He had enough altitude to glide the 12 miles back to the airfield. An Air Force pilot flying a P-38 had a brother in the 164th, so he decided to visit him. Since the blacktop runway had never been cleared of mines, a wheel and wing were totaled when he landed. I imagine that was covered up by saying he had to make a forced landing. Mac received an urgent call from the regimental CO, who had evidently become disenchanted with both his executive officer and the regimental S3. He said to Mac, "They are both cowards. I am sending them up to you to inspect the companies on the line, the ones under fire." When Mac told me what the CO had said, I began to laugh. I noted a grin on his face too. He had little use for either man. I said, "Let me take the S3 up to Company G. It's quiet there, but if anyone moves, the Japanese shoot." He grinned. "I'll take the exec up to Company F. He'll crap in his pants up there." We waited impatiently for a half hour. Finally, our two guests arrived. Stepping from the jeep, the exec questioned Mac, who had a smile on his face. "What's the situation?" Mac told him a bit, but finally couldn't contain himself any longer. "I'll take you up to Company F to see their problems. Walker can take the S3 up to Company G. Both of those companies are on the line." The exec gazed around, then turned to the S3. I noted the squirrely look that passed between them. They were scared stiff. "I guess we've seen all we need to here. We'll leave you now. Things look well in hand." "Whoa," Mac said. "The CO told me to take you up to the companies under fire." He got dirty looks from both men as they ignored him and climbed into the jeep. This was too much. Smiling, I said, "A bit afraid, are you?" The looks cast at me would have killed an elephant. Both remained silent. The night before we were relieved by 1st Battalion, we bunched the battalion together in a perimeter to facilitate loading the next morning. Some group left a jeep loaded with radios outside the perimeter. It was blown up by a Japanese, a loss due to criminal carelessness. When daylight came, we returned to Dumaguete for a rest. I had 3 days off before I received a call from the regimental exec. "Captain Walker, you will go back up the mountain and take command of the 1st Battalion." I should have expected this revenge, but questioned, "Where is the 1st Battalion CO? Where is his exec?" "They are both sick." "How about the line company COs?" "Never mind them. You will go up there this afternoon and take charge." So I did, spending nearly another week in the clouds, soaking wet every hour, day and night. The low scud had moved in. Visibility was limited to only a few yards. There was no shooting since there was no visibility. I found the supposed battalion was only about at full company strength. Where were the rest of the officers and men? Later I found the exec had lied to me. I was to find that the regimental CO had relieved the 1st Battalion commander of his duties. This was trouble. On my way up to the 1st Battalion, I had passed by a group of Filipino guerrillas who were supposed to protect the supply line to the battalion. There were about 50 men in this group. They were bunched together on a hill with no prepared positions. One evening, a couple of days before we were relieved, furious firing broke out down the mountain where the guerrillas were stationed. The next morning a messenger arrived from their leader. The message read, "Sir, we were heavily attacked by a large group of enemy last night. We have expended all of our ammunition. We are going home." It was a good laugh and typical of guerrilla leadership. I doubted the Japanese had made any attack. The guerrillas always wanted to go home. Finally, ordered to withdraw, I walked the entire 12 miles down from 4,400 feet in sopping wet shoes that distorted, the leather stretching completely out of shape. My toes slid forward, and upon reaching the rear area, I had blisters on the end of each toe. The next day I couldn't walk. 2 weeks later, I found a bunion growing on each foot. One of our replacements to Easy Company was Zane Jacobs. He tells a few of his experiences. The regiment had taken a number of casualties in the Leyte and Cebu actions, and all companies were undermanned. I was assigned to a platoon of Easy with only 18 or 19 men in the entire platoon, my squad having only 5 men. A squad's strength is 12 men. Jack Cachell was our platoon sergeant and leader. He was from Arizona, a regular army man. When I was a raw recruit in 45, I was filled with misinformation about the enemy we faced. Sergeant Cachell soon erased that garbage with a 30-minute talk when we were assigned to his platoon. The next operation on Negros completed the fast forward of what to do and not do. In the excitement of landing on Negros Island that first night, I was dug in on the west side of the battalion perimeter, blocking a road. This road led from the city of Dumaguete back into the mountains. We were ordered to hold our fire, expecting our regimental reconnaissance unit to join us. Shortly, all hell broke loose with our heavy .30 caliber machine guns on the east side of the perimeter cutting loose. Just before the firing started, we could hear truck gears grinding as trucks drove through our circle and exited the west edge of the block. Sergeant Brown yelled at us to shoot west at random to try to hit the trucks that had already passed by. Later, I found that after the enemy trucks went through our perimeter, a column of Japanese followed behind them on foot. That's when the East Road Guard finally opened fire. The next afternoon we came into a semi-cleared area, with a stone fence perpendicular to our line of advance. The coconut trees were in orderly rows with a small shack about 150-200 yards through the trees. My platoon was told to use the wall as cover, for Sergeant Jack Cachell had spotted 2 trucks near the house, also 3 Japanese nearby. 1 enemy soldier appeared to be wounded. We opened fire, but I believe 2 enemy faded into the jungle without being killed. The wounded man was left behind. Later, my squad was point for easy. Going up a ridge near a knob, we were hit by Nambu machine gun fire. Lozano was point scout. He dived across an opening in the underbrush made earlier by an artillery or mortar burst. I was just behind him when a bullet cut across his forehead, temporarily blinding him. I never saw him again after he got off the hill. A big, tall Texan named Hale was our forward bar man. He stepped into the shell opening and fired at the Nambu position. He had a good shot uphill about 50 yards, stopping the Nambu for a couple of minutes until the dead gunner was replaced. The new gunner cut loose a few rounds and caught one of our men through the ankle, shattering the joint. He was evacuated and never returned to the company. Hale took out the second gunner and then carried his ankle-shot buddy down off the hill. During those hectic minutes, Utah Christopher, a seasoned veteran of other campaigns, panicked. He scooted around the hill until he came upon me, scared and saying he was going back down off the hill. I was located about 15 yards below the Nambu and below its line of fire. When the gun fired bursts, I could tell he was depressed as low as possible, shooting 3 or 4 inches above me from the way the grass and brush were shearing off. I told Chris to calm down and that we might figure some way to get through the brush without being seen and wipe out the gun. Chris did not buy this and eased down the slope, raising him into the line of fire. Within a couple of minutes after he left me, I heard the Nambu sweep another burst of fire, and it caught Chris. The brush and grass must have given his position away as he moved through. I heard the bullet hit Chris, and he was soon dead. About 10 minutes later, Sergeant Cachell came around the other side of the hill. He, or the heavy .30 machine gun, knocked out the Nambu. Jack asked me if I knew where Chris was located. I inquired about a bar man named Gower, who I thought had also been hit. Gower had gotten down okay. We dropped about 100 yards off the hill, and while we were talking, Jack said, "We have to go back up the hill and get Chris out. We never leave a wounded or dead man." I was not anxious to go back up the hill, but was the only one who knew where Chris was located, so Jack and I went back up to recover him. Chris had taken a .25 caliber round through his chest, from right to left. About 5 or 6 weeks after joining the platoon in Easy Company, we had a cocksure second Louis assigned as platoon leader. I cannot remember this second John's name, but it seems to have started with a B. He was all spit and polish, and evidently didn't like the way we smelled. There was no chance to wash all those days on Negros Island. A couple of days after he took over, I asked Jack if he had any success in talking to the lieutenant about staying alive. Jack glared at me and told me the lieutenant had been approached and had read Jack the Riot Act, so he let it drop. He said there were 2 things that could happen. The lieutenant would learn and live, or not learn and die. A couple of days later, we took another hill. Artillery had laid down a good barrage, and there were a couple of cleared spots right on the ridge between where we were hunkered down and the next ridge about 250 yards up the mountain. These spots were cleared of brush and visible to anyone in the trees near the top. It took about 2 or 3 steps to cross the clearing. I was about 30 yards from one of the clearings and was looking through the brush up the hill when the lieutenant, with a swagger stick in his hand, came up the path. He headed along the ridge toward the other squad on the other side of the clearing. When he got close, I spoke to him and tried to warn him to duck down slope when he crossed the clear area. Mr. Know-it-all stopped and told me that when he wanted to hear from a private, he would ask me, and did I know to keep my mouth shut until then? I just said, "Yes, sir." He took about 10-12 steps and started across the clearing. 1.25 caliber shot got him 250 yards, in the kidneys. He got a one-way ticket, and we never heard from him again. The next day we took that knob again. A bunch of Japanese charged up the hill to us in a banzai. We got over a dozen of them, but the guy carrying the sword never got hit. He made it off the hill. An easy man about 30 feet from me was hit by a bullet that detonated one of the hand grenades he was carrying on the strap across his chest, blowing his chest open. I took my grenades off and stuck them in my belt after that. I saw the lieutenant get hit, but never knew his name. I remember Walker sprinkling him with sulphur. I was about 20 feet off the trail and downhill from an artillery observer attached to our outfit. He was watching down the trail. Suddenly he cut loose with his Tommy gun. When I turned about 45 degrees to my right to see why he was shooting, I saw he had taken out 3 Japanese soldiers about 50 feet down the hill, just below us. This second attempt to take the same hill brought a flurry of mortar fire down upon us. All the rounds were landing on the forward edge of the ridge, about 75-100 yards from our line. Captain Walker called for artillery fire to silence the incoming from about 300 yards up the ridge. Within about 10 minutes there was no more incoming, and the captain was talking with Jack Cachell about why the mortar was falling away from our men and on one spot on the hill. Jack asked for volunteers by pointing to me and 2 other men in the squad to go have a look. We discovered a cave entrance with a huge amount of small arms ammunition and explosives inside. The captain was made aware of this and knew that if a lucky hit had entered the opening, the hilltop we were on would have erupted. Volunteers were asked to empty the cave of explosives and bring some into our perimeter. 3 of us took turns carefully passing out the boxes of explosives while looking for booby traps. We rotated each 10 minutes because of the heat and difficulty. In addition to the ammo, there were several items of a personal nature which we figured belonged to at least 3 or 4 of the enemy. All ammo and souvenirs were moved before sunset. I noticed that whenever a chow line formed at Easy, nearly every man was accompanied by a Filipino child he had more or less adopted. They even ate from the soldiers' mess kits. Word came down that this feeding of civilians was prohibited, but the order did little good. A hungry child is still a hungry child. Our garbage cans were plundered by the kids for anything they could take home to their parents. Food was hard to come by. Our so-called grey locker fund came through. Officers had paid $10 months ago and were to receive 6 quarts of tax-free liquor each. The original 6 officers had agreed that if they were no longer with the company when the bottles arrived, the survivors would inherit the booze. I was presented with 36 quarts as the surviving officer. It was a problem easily solved. 35 quarts were turned over to the non-coms for distribution to the men, and I kept 1 quart to celebrate my luck at surviving. Because I was off duty, I drank it all in one night. You can guess the rest. Early one evening, Mac notified me I was to take a small task force around the island to cut off Japanese suspected of crossing to the opposite side. I was to leave at dawn the next morning, accompanied by Easy Company, a battery of 105 mm guns from the 245th Field Artillery, 175 Filipino guerrillas, plus a long-range radio. I was unable to obtain much information that night, but at the city docks the next morning it all came together. Our transportation was an LSM, landing ship medium, and an LCI. Immediately after appearing at the docks, the artillery loaded their prime movers with guns and men onto the LSM, and Easy men with their supplies boarded the LCI. There was a short wait for the guerrillas, commanded by Major Louboutin. They and their food supply, stored in several large heavy bags, were loaded onto the open-decked LSM. My jeep and trailer, heavily loaded with rations, also went on to the LSM. Approaching the south shore of Cahueton Point on the west side of Negros Island at 5 p.m., both landing craft struck a sandbar nearly 1,000 feet from the beach. By judicious transfer of water ballast, they edged over and reached shore. Dropping ramps, all men, guns and army gear were quickly unloaded. The guerrillas moved inland about 200 yards and sat. The artillery immediately looked for firing positions facing inland, and Easy began setting up a perimeter defence. The skipper of the LSM came ashore to look for me, and I could see he was worried. "Captain, the food for those guerrillas is still on board my boat. The tide is going out fast. If I don't get out in the next few minutes, I'll be stuck here. I sure don't want to lose my craft to the Japanese if they cross the island." "Wait! I'll see they get it off immediately." Approaching Major Louboutin, I said, "Gather some of your men and get your rations off the ship fast. I'll send one of my men to help." As soon as it was off, I called back the Major, and he told me they would do it. I returned to the captain to give him the good news, and he proceeded to keep the engine going. "Don't worry about us. Just get your boat out, and we will wait for you to return. It is getting late." Both craft were used, but both companies went up the east and west sides of the peninsula to ensure coverage of the base of the islands. We were warned, too, that there were probably Japanese hiding in some of the caves along the beaches. All members of Easy Company went into hiding at 9 p.m. Around midnight, I decided to give the Japanese a test. This was a trap I had been thinking of for months. I ordered a single short burst of automatic fire. That was my call sign to the guerrillas, and if they were listening, they should know that my men were positioned about 100 yards behind them, and that I was setting up a surveillance line toward their cave. The captain heard the gunfire and whispered, "What's that? Are we still okay?" "Yes, we are doing fine. Relax." It was 2 hours after I fired my weapon when we first heard the sound of a boat approaching the shore. There were whispers and a few murmurs among the men. My eyes and ears were sharp for any indication of a Japanese patrol coming our way. After about 5 minutes, I heard the soft patter of footsteps coming from the cave area, so I ordered the men to get ready to fire. My men were in a tense mood, hoping they could finish what they had begun. They expected we could catch the Japanese by surprise, but when I heard a voice call out in Filipino, I immediately knew my ruse had worked. My signal had been picked up, and the guerrillas responded as I had planned. I held my breath, waited, and then heard shouting, and the whole jungle came alive. A moment later, I saw the first group of guerrillas approach from the cave area. They had been alerted and were heading toward the sound of the gunfire. I then saw the very men I had trained earlier who had volunteered to join the fight. I called to them, "Wait! Don't go in! Stay behind the trees!" As I moved closer to them, I explained, "We were testing the waters to see if there were any Japanese hiding in the caves along this ridge, and this was an excellent job you did. We're going to clear the area." We moved further down the trail, eventually splitting into 2 groups to cover both sides of the ridge. I was amazed at how quickly the guerrillas were able to maneuver through the trees. They were sharp and always alert. In fact, they took over our perimeter and, before dawn, began clearing out the caves along the ridge. That morning we heard stories from the local Filipinos. The Japanese had been in and out of the area several times, so it was clear that they were aware of our presence on the island. "You mean I've come all of these miles just to pick up you two in a jeep?" He shook his head, obviously put out. He was a good host, though, inviting me to eat with him at his mess table. We arrived back in Dumaguete after dark. Upon my arrival, no questions were asked. It was as if this expedition had never taken place. It seemed that soon after we had left for the west side of the island, the powers that be had found the Japanese had headed north, up the island, instead of crossing to our side. 2 days later, I was directed to go around the lower end of the island by coastal road. I was to hire labour and put the road to Cahueton Point back in shape. Stopping here and there, using my interpreter, I had no trouble finding men who wanted employment. I was even able to find responsible supervisors. A few days later, I took my roster of men and their hours to the CIC, Counterintelligence Corps, office to get money to pay their wages. There were no questions asked. They gave me wads of money in a brown paper sack. They seemed unworried about the expenditure. I signed no receipts or formal papers. It was easy to see how corruption could creep into the ranks if every military office operated this way. In a room adjoining the office, they had about 6 No. 5 Underwood typewriters. Also sitting around in this room were 6 attractive teenage mestizo girls, evidently hired as typist secretaries. I took the opportunity to sit at one of the typewriters to write a brief note to my wife. The girls crowded around to watch. Evidently none could type and were astounded that I could. These girls were not hired for their office abilities. There was more going on here than met the eye. I wondered, how do GIs get such cushy CIC jobs? Elements of the 77th Division, together with a parachute outfit, entered Dumaguete to take over the reins from us. We were to return to Cebu Island, north of Cebu City, to an area near Sibulan. It took a full day to pay off the Filipinos working on the South Road around the island. They had done a remarkable job clearing the jungle away from the road. The road was now not only passable, but a scenic drive all the way to the river just short of Cawiton Point. I was the last vehicle of the battalion to leave Negros. Up the island, about 8 miles from Dumaguete, was an LCM landing. The trip across to Cebu was brief. It took only half an hour to cross. The west coastal road leading north was of macadam with numerous potholes. It seemed there was a dog resting on the road every few miles. Evidently, they liked the warmth of the blacktop in the early sun. They acted as if they owned the highway, refusing to move for our jeep. Crossing over east to Cebu City, we again swung north about 25 miles to Sibulan. This town had been a leper colony prior to the war, but most of the diseased people had moved away to avoid the enemy. Inland, about 2 to 3 miles, we found our bivouac area, a former Japanese camp. It had a large NEPA building about 30 by 90 feet, more than adequate for a battalion headquarters. Tents for the companies were already set up since the battalion had arrived a day or two previously. On a side hill, just across from the large building, the A and P section had set up a row of small officer tents. An electrical cable had been tied to the front pole of each tent, the huge generator parked just across the road. Mac and I shared the tent farthest from the road. The next tent held a Servel kerosene refrigerator we had purchased in Dumaguete. It functioned as a communal cooler. Even some critical medical supplies were stored inside. We reverted to a training status with replacements, but had more casualties there. 2 men found a tape measure mine and began playing catch with it. When it was caught by one of the men, it exploded. They had been warned and warned. One evening, a dump truck driver from the engineers stopped alongside the road. He accosted me. "I've got a load of mixed cement that's setting up fast. I've got to dump it somewhere mighty soon." "Where was it supposed to go?" "To regimental headquarters of the 164th Infantry. I didn't know the location of our regimental headquarters, but knew our men liked to play basketball. A concrete court would be an asset, so I said, "Just dump it over there on that level ground." As he raised the hoist, I passed the word, and several men showed up with form lumber and trowels. It was only a 6-yard load, but it was a start. Our A and P officer made connections with the cement plant north of Cebu City the next morning. A few days later, we had a basketball court of concrete regulation size. I later found the load of cement was for the floor of Colonel Mahoney's private mess tent. The regimental S4 called me later and gave me hell. We were sleeping soundly one rainy night when we heard a sudden whooshing sound. Our tent was gone. We were fully exposed to the rain, our cots were tipped over, and the tent next to us was on fire. At first I thought of a mortar round, but changed my mind when I heard cursing all down the line of officer tents. Each tent was flat on the ground, and it was raining heavily. The engineers had been gravelling the road into our area, and the driver of one truck had forgotten to lower the hoist on his vehicle. The truck box caught the heavy electrical wire high above the road, ripping down the entire row of tents. I felt sorry for that driver. He caught hell. Our Serval refrigerator operated with a kerosene flame and, being tipped over, set the tent on fire. Fortunately, it was raining hard enough that the slowly burning tent was no problem. Mac finally opened his thoughts to me. We became friends. He had reached the point where he was able to put his fears aside. He finally agreed with my tenet. Do your best, forget the rest. Of course, no leader forgets his mistakes. Some days later, he was briefly hospitalized. When he came back, he never mentioned the past, but I noticed a new self-confidence and camaraderie. He had questioned me about fear. I told him that the more combat a soldier goes through, the less he worries. I mentioned Colonel John Gossett. The men almost worshipped him because he was a leader with confidence, and he instilled confidence in everyone. After all, combat leadership is the one important factor in combat performance. We still had the 2 generators we had picked out of caves above Cebu City, so we hunted up more concrete to build a volleyball court. Both courts were illuminated at night and saw plenty of action. While eating supper one evening, someone said, "Look at that!" There was a monkey atop one of our floodlight poles on the volleyball court. The animal casually unscrewed one of the large bulbs, dropping it to the pavement. Those high-wattage bulbs were almost impossible to obtain, so I shot the monkey. It turned out to be the pet of the motor pool bunch. The mechanics were not happy with me. Every town had its own special building for cockfights, since fighting the birds was legal. Hearing that I had a fighting cock, the officers took it upon themselves to scheme up a fight. I was to be the financial loser, since they had found a ringer. They came up with the owner of a champion rooster and had the man bring his bird around one evening. At the time, I had a few dollars on hand, but was suspicious. I agreed to the cockfight, but wouldn't allow them to put knives on the legs of the fighters. When they dropped the birds to the ground, they went at it. Because the champion rooster was faster, it seemed he would soon be the winner. However, time was in the larger bird's favour. My rooster, actually, I should say he belonged to my interpreter, pinned down the other bird by sheer weight and stamina. In a few more seconds he would have killed it. The Filipino owner quickly grabbed up his bird and ran some distance away. My loser friends, out a few bucks, wanted to see the conclusion. They were angry at the owner of the other fighter. Poor man, he explained that if his bird was defeated too badly, it would never fight again. This didn't mollify a few of the officers. They wanted blood. Our bird was well fed each day and was kept tied by a small string to the front stake of Mac's and my tent. Each morning, as the sky lightened, he stood proudly and proclaimed the start of another day. Finally, Mac laid it on the line. "That darned bird has got to go. No more of that 4 a.m. crowing." It was turned over to the battalion cooks for the officers' mess. The large bird looked grand as it came from the oven. Everyone waited expectantly for the first bite, only to find the bird so tough it couldn't be eaten. It was like chewing rubber. Our 1st and 3rd battalions were commanded by experienced majors who had been in combat for 2.5 years. To our chagrin, 2 West Point lieutenant colonels arrived to take over command of the battalions. In an attempt to gain our support, the new CO of the 3rd Battalion hosted a party for the various battalion staffs. It was held in the 2nd story of a schoolhouse, about 15 miles south of our camp. When Mac and I arrived, the large room on the 2nd floor was crowded. Somehow that colonel had found about 10 girls to entertain us. The music came from an old upright Victrola phonograph that needed an occasional winding and changing of records. Mac and I participated at the bar until I became bored and took up post at the phonograph. Looking at the girls, I realized they were all prostitutes. Where on earth did that colonel find them? Where did he have this type of connection? When the record ended, I was about to turn it over when the former CO of the 1st Battalion shouted drunkenly to me, "Hey, play that record over again." We were not the best of friends, and his demand irritated me, or it may have been the drinks I'd had. Smiling, I broke the 78 revolutions per minute record over my head. He came at me, leading with his chin. He flew backward about 15 feet and out the open side door, tumbling down the 18 to 20 steps to the ground. He was badly bruised and unconscious. Captain Hamer, who had been coming up the stairs after taking a leak, puzzled. What happened to Henry? I was savvy enough to make myself scarce after that. On Saturday night, the new 1st Battalion colonel had his party. It was held at battalion headquarters. The high brass were drinking heavily. I anticipated a blow-up, so nursed my beer. Soon, vitriolic accusations were made about these 2 pointers taking over our battalions without any combat experience. The subject turned to the invasion of Japan, Operation Olympic. The new colonel of the 1st Battalion was exceedingly drunk and bragged, "Hell, you National Guard and Reserve officers are going to take your lumps. Frank and I are going back on 45-day leaves to the States. We're not going to Japan with you." His buddy Frank drunkenly spoke up. "Hell no! My father-in-law is commandant at Fort Sam Houston. Do you think he's going to allow his son-in-law to be killed in Japan?" We sober ones were shocked, but I admired Henry when he said, "You damned cowards, they ought to abolish West Point." That ended the party, but if looks could kill, there would have been 2 dead West Point lieutenant colonels. A day or 2 later, these 2 lieutenant colonels did leave for the States. During my remaining time in the Philippines, and later in Japan, they never returned to our regiment. After the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, the first on August 6, 1945, we later heard Hirohito and his cabinet announce their surrender on August 14th, but the final word came to us on the evening of August 15th by radio. A murmur spread across the wide expanse of our tents, growing in volume to a lion's roar. Our discipline held. There was no firing of weapons. Not so in Cebu City with the ships in the harbour. Promiscuous firing there killed several men. Word came that the Americal Division was attempting to negotiate with the remaining Japanese on the island and accomplish a surrender. This was finally realized after a Japanese officer was taken under a white flag to division headquarters to listen to broadcasts from Japan. After that, his commander, Lieutenant General Sachi Kataoka, agreed to surrender to the Americal Division. The ceremony was to take place on August 29th. For the surrender affair, our regiment was to furnish a full company of men, none less than 6 feet in height. I laughed about that. Who were we trying to impress? What fool had cooked this up? That is, I laughed until I found I was stuck to command that composite company at the surrender. We left early in the morning, supposed to be there by 10 a.m. The trucks kicked up copious amounts of dust while the sun did its best to raise the temperature to scorching. Unfortunately, many of the men felt used, and disgruntled remarks came fast and furious as I attempted to gain a formation. 4 or 5 malcontents became mouthy. I lost my temper and told one to step out to the rear of the column when he ignored my order. My old sergeant from Company H, a burly man, snarled at him, "And if he can't whip you, it'll be my turn to beat the hell out of you." These few men were not from the 2nd Battalion. Their behaviour indicated a total lack of discipline in their own companies. I suddenly felt stupid to have lost my temper this way. I turned to face the troublemakers. "Take a good look at those Japanese across from us. They are standing at attention like soldiers, not fooling a bit. Note that every man in the front rank wears a complete uniform, while others in the rear are nearly naked. They have passed parts of uniforms to the front rank to dress their men fully. Then take a look at some further back, with a leg or arm missing. Where is your pride? You are witnessing something you will talk about for the rest of your lives. You are lucky men." And I must have said the right thing, since the men looked shamefaced. They turned into soldiers again. We had been ordered to place a light machine gun 15 feet to our front, as had the other 2 companies representing the other regiments in the division. When this was done, cries of apprehension were heard from the Japanese troops. I had objected to this, for they had no weapons, having stacked theirs in a pile the size of a house. What stupid senior officer had come up with this idea? Where was the trust on our part? 1 shot fired, and what a melee we'd have. The ceremony went as planned. General Kataoka came forward with 3 other generals and an admiral. His samurai sword was handed to the division commander, and the affair was over. After we fell out of formation, the Japanese, all 2,667 of them, loaded into a huge convoy of trucks for transportation to a spot below Cebu City. There, under supervision, they were allowed to build and police their own camp. I was told later that there were several Japanese women among the prisoners. If true, they were probably hospital personnel. Our vehicles were spaced here and there in the long convoy, and our troops did their best to stop the rock throwing by Filipinos along the highway. Once or twice we stopped to stare them down. They backed off. Tired and grimy with road dust, we finally arrived back at the regiment in time for supper. Although I was battalion exec and no longer associated with Easy, I sauntered over to their headquarters to inquire about my personal property locked in their company safe. It had been a policy that the company clerk kept money and valuables stored for the men in the issue lockbox. I was informed that my old company clerk, Chatterton, in whom I had the utmost trust, upon his rotation, had stolen everything within the safe. The theft represented quite an amount, but since the war was over and he was already in the States, probably discharged by now, what would be gained by pursuing him? I lost a considerable amount of Japanese currency and several old silver Filipino dollars dated before 1900. These all came from Japanese pockets. A day or two before we loaded aboard ship and left for Yokohama, Japan, Mac came up with news. "Chuck, the quartermaster has stores of beer going to waste. They'll sell it for $2 a case. Why don't you load up your jeep and trailer with beer? I'll take our bedrolls and other equipment in my rig." The idea sounded good, so I said, "I'll speak with the battalion staff and see if they want to share. I'm sure they will. How much shall I get?" Mac laughed. "You should be able to get at least 4 feet above the sides of the trailer if they'll sell you that much. Tarp it tight like it's ammunition. If someone suspects it's beer, it will disappear." I smelled the beer long before I entered the quartermaster's fence. My driver and I gasped in awe at the sheer amount of it rotting away. They had piled cases nearly 30 feet high, so high that the lower cases were crushed. Stale, sour beer ran everywhere. To make matters worse, the heap was at least 70 feet wide and a city block long. What the men would have given for this beer these feather-headed men had wasted, all stored in an open field, subject to every vagary of the weather. The non-com in charge told me to take what we wanted. He added, "You'll have to dig deep in the mess to get undamaged cases." It was true. My driver and I worked like beavers to finally find over 150 cases that appeared okay. We tarped the trailer tightly, adding several cases to the rear seat of the Jeep. When we later arrived in Japan, we found the cases stored in the Jeep gone. The ship's crew had a way down into the hold and had helped themselves. Thankfully, they must have thought the big load in the trailer was ammo. Early on the morning of September 1st, we trucked to Cebu City in preparation for our trip to Yokohama. No plans were confirmed, but we assumed we would be assigned to occupation duties. We had no idea what they would be. On the 9th day, we entered the harbour at Yokohama, and what a show! Literally hundreds of ships were crowded in the harbour. We had been constantly worried about our few aircraft carriers. Now there seemed to be an overabundance. There were carriers, battleships, cruisers, transports, destroyers, and almost every type of craft that existed. Judging from the ships' flags, it seemed nearly every Allied country was represented, even vessels from South America. Slipping into our assigned pier, we began unloading troops as quickly as possible. When transportation became available, Mac immediately took our men inland. I remained to unload our equipment and battalion gear. A huge warehouse stood on our dock, the large door securely locked by a massive brass padlock. For lack of something to do while we awaited our equipment, inquisitive men found a bolt cutter and the lock turned to cheese. Inside were several brand-new 100 10-volt generators, which were confiscated as booty. Each company took one, unnecessary, as we later found everything in Japan fully electrified. It was dark when I had the remaining vehicles assembled, and a guide appeared to lead us to our new home. At midnight we arrived at a large building, a former Japanese radar school. Leaving my jeep and trailer near the north door, I entered a fully lighted room occupied by our battalion staff. A guard stood just outside the door. My cot with bedroll had been prepared for me, and resting upon it, I began to remove my blouse. Looking around the room, I noted the other 5 occupants seemed to be sound asleep. Strange, I thought, the light is still on. Were they that played out? I suddenly felt a sharp stab at my arm. Looking down, I saw a large red flea. I slapped. Too late. Missed it. This building had fleas. Hilarious laughter broke out. It was Captain Manuel, our 2nd Battalion Headquarters CO. Suddenly all the sleepers cast aside their blankets and sat up. They were fully dressed. Mac, rubbing his eyes, asked, "Where's the beer?" Tired or not, they piled outside and carried every case into the room. 2 or 3 beers later, they finally slept. It was shortly after our arrival in Japan that I received an order notifying me I was finally a major in the United States Army. We were issued a crude map of our assigned district with orders to visit each factory, stopping production of war materials. Each day we pursued these duties, closing plants and inspecting businesses. Our targeted area was predominantly industrial. There we found machine shops and foundries still in full production. When we closed down a manufacturer, the workers continued to arrive day after day, standing by their machines. We had been told that plans were in place to convert the factories to the production of civilian goods, but those orders never materialized. I had been assigned a personal interpreter, an elderly, dignified gentleman teacher from an Episcopal girls' school located near our radar building. This school had a basement machine shop where the girls were busy machining pistons and connecting rods for Japanese aircraft. I had been told that lies were a polite way of evasion in Japan, and found it to be true. With about 8 men, I inspected a large prison, I believe it was Sugami Prison, with many prisoners. When we entered the office, the women clerks began screaming hysterically, running wildly into the ladies' toilet. Evidently, their propaganda machine had labelled us Americans as rapists. We ignored them, my interpreter and I going directly to the warden's office while my men checked the prisoners and further searched the building. The warden, after offering us a small cup of tea, denied any knowledge of manufacturing war materials. The few men I sent below returned with explosive shell components, parts from a well-equipped machine shop in the basement. I had the men inspect every prisoner confined, but they found all inmates were Japanese. We were shocked to discover that every huge stamping press and most other machinery in the factories had been manufactured in the United States. 1st Battalion liberated a pistol factory, but kept the workers busy completing the assembly of nearly 500 Nambu 7.65 mm pistols to be given to the men returning home. A coal mine produced, as I remember, 6 Canadians captured at Hong Kong. One of these soldiers was Charlie Fisher. Later, we became good friends when I was bush-flying in Ontario, Canada. The story of his treatment was horrifying. From Yokohama to Tokyo, the destruction was complete, with miles of nothing, just burned out or smashed buildings. A few brick smokestacks had survived. Bomb craters were everywhere, with smoke still coming from piles of twisted girders and masonry. It was a macabre sight, mile upon mile of rubble as we journeyed toward Tokyo. Efforts had been made to clear the main highways, as streetcars were already back in operation. To my surprise, I found the Ginza untouched. The downtown jewel of central Tokyo had not been harmed. Certainly, just the opposite had happened in Germany. Berlin had been totally destroyed. It was then I began to question our government's motives and strategies, and the political power of big corporations. Going farther north along the coast, I ran into oil refineries and storage facilities. They had not been bombed. A stop at Atsugi Airfield was another mind-blower. True, it had been strafed with bullets, but it had not been bombed. It was then someone pointed out to me that political power held sway. Even Lever Brothers' plantation on Guadalcanal was rumoured to have been the recipient of a large settlement for damages. If true, the Japanese should have paid. Their bombardments caused nearly all the devastation. Dick Hamer and I checked many of the newer Japanese aircraft at Atsugi Airfield. One reasonable copy of a B-25 had a 75 mm cannon installed in the nose. Another aircraft, one of their latest models, had an inline engine. Later, I found few had been made, but they were very fast. We watched as American pilots flew old Japanese biplanes for entertainment. Under the surrender terms, all propellers were supposed to have been removed prior to our landing. A second trip to the Ginza showed many items for sale, all at astronomical prices. Our new pay, only 13 yen to the dollar, was MacArthur's sick joke. It would not even buy a package of gum. We heard rumours of banks being stripped and other devious criminal acts by the high-ups. These were only rumours until it was later disclosed that a quart of cut diamonds showed up in the United States. A Colonel Nickerson, high staff, was supposedly convicted by a court-martial. American newspapers said the diamonds were carried to the United States by a WAC captain. We heard nothing further. It was evidently covered up as usual. Bad press. For several days I felt like a procurer for the battalion. The job was enlightening, as it enabled me to see much of the country and farmland. Due to the dense population, the farms were small, more like flower gardens, not a weed to be seen. I was ordered to travel along a major highway, consulting with police chiefs in the various towns about allowing our men to visit their cities. My interpreter, as I mentioned, was a dignified, staid and proper man from an Episcopal girls' school. He became very upset. The first thing each police chief did was consult with him about setting up a special house of prostitution in their city. While we drank the usually offered small cup of tea, I watched my interpreter squirm. He wished nothing to do with harlotry, and arguments ensued. Sad to say, the policeman always won. Days later, as I probed farther inland, I passed crude signs reading, "Paradise ahead." Farther along, there would be a sign pointing directly at a door, "Paradise here." U.S. Army engineers running a fuel pipeline to a nearby airstrip ran into a problem. The pipe was put in place, but the next morning, before pumping could begin, 2 miles of it had disappeared. It seemed there were still some hard losers. It was finally decided that we, the remaining 8 officers of the 164th Infantry, could return home. Unfortunately, one of our officers was bumped. He had witnessed an accident and had to remain for a court-martial. We were transferred to the 43rd Division for movement to the United States. As many of us were scheduled to go by train to Atsugi Airfield, I argued with Mac, "It's only a half hour by jeep. Let's go the easy way." "Heck, Chuck, let's take the train. It might be enlightening." It definitely was. We were crowded in small seats from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. before arriving at the airport. Japanese train cars are made for people of small stature, not 6-footers. At Atsugi Airfield, I was assigned as Regimental S2. Then I was assigned to be in charge of laying out a tent camp for an entire infantry division that was on its way from Europe. Now I was positive every big shot in this 43rd Division was crazy. This was a job for Army engineers. The second night on the airfield, a terrific wind came up. The many Japanese aircraft lying about the field were not tied down. They were blown to one end of the field against a huge fence. Nearly all were destroyed. Thankfully, a ship finally became available, and we moved to the docks along with officers of the 1st Cavalry Division. As we were not leaving Japan until the next morning, Mac and I left the ship after 6 p.m., walking over to a nearby subway station. Pedestrian traffic was heavy, but people were moving at a leisurely pace along the sidewalks. We noticed as the people passed down the long, slanted ramps to the subway, however, they sped up. When we reached the train area, everyone was running at a furious pace. It was comical. Stopping in the large toilet area, I had to admire Japanese ingenuity. Everything was of tile and drained to the multiple bowls that were set flush in the floor. Beside each bowl were 2 high bricks on which you stood. Along the wall hung a large hose, so that caring for the bathroom was reduced to just a squirt of water. There was no privacy. Back on the ship, I received another surprise. I was assigned as mess officer until our arrival in Frisco. It was now mid-October 1945. As there were so many officers present, I wondered how this had come about. I questioned Mac, but he said he was just as puzzled as I was. I was given rosters of men and the compartments they could be found in. Any attempt to get workers was doomed. All promised, but none showed up. That is, until the next evening, when the men found this was not a catered trip. By the 3rd day, I had more help than I needed. Those who came faithfully ate like kings. A few days later, we went under the Golden Gate Bridge and tied up at Pier 51. on the opposite side from which we had left. Talk about a coincidence. A dock worker struck up a conversation with me, saying, "A lovely girl from the Fiji Islands arrived yesterday as a war bride. She asked where she could find her husband, an officer named Digby. It happened he came in just a day or two before her, telling me he was going to stay at the Mark. I hope she found him. Digby was one of our original officers of the 164th Infantry. I wished him well. We loaded aboard a Catalina ferry and proceeded to Camp Stoneman. On the third morning, we loaded onto a train for Fort Lewis, Washington. There, an examining board of brass interviewed Mac, Bill Smith, Henry Brown, and me. They wanted us to stay in the Army, probably because of our efficiency ratings in combat. Mac and Bill agreed to stay, while Henry and I bowed out, signing in the reserves. The offer they made to us was, "We'll allow you a 45-day leave in the United States, but you must return to Japan at the end of that time. We will guarantee to ship your families to Japan within 6 months." We had been overseas nearly 4 years, and to date I had had a 1-day official leave of absence in 5.5 years of service. To offer 45 days leave in the United States when we had 4 months leave coming and had already lost a month and a half, the maximum leave you could accumulate was 120 days, was a bad joke. Also, the promise concerning our families was phony. We knew the situation in Japan all too well. After a final physical, a doctor told me I had heart problems that should be checked. I thanked him, telling him I had a little girl 3 years old I had never seen. I wasn't about to sit around Fort Lewis for another 2 or 3 weeks. All chances of getting transportation home seemed slim. The wait at the quartermaster for train tickets was at least 2 weeks. That evening, after supper, Henry and I went to the Seattle Railroad station for tickets, only to be told bluntly to get the hell out of the line. "We sell only to civilians. If you want a ticket, get it from your quartermaster." After that snide remark, I was strongly tempted to drag that smart-assed ticket man through the grill. He had never been near a bullet. Common sense ruled, so Henry and I adjourned to a bar to talk it over. Greyhound was on strike at the time, but about 11 p.m. we heard a loudspeaker announcement from next door. "Jackrabbit bus lines leaving for Boise, Idaho in 20 minutes. Henry looked at me. "That's closer to home. Let's go." 3 nights later, I was able to phone my wife from Jamestown, North Dakota, while the bus made a 20-minute stop. She met me at the Fargo bus depot 2 hours later. I had not seen her for 3.5 years. She was as beautiful as ever. An hour later, I admired my daughter as she lay asleep in bed. My wife had lived with her folks during the war. The next morning, I awoke to find a small hand pulling the sheet from my face. Then a puzzled voice came. "Mummy, who is that strange man in bed with you?" 35 years after the war, I received a phone call from a man who said, "This is Paul Clemens." I said, "Paul is dead. What are you trying to pull?" He answered, "Darn it all, Chuck, this is Paul. I heard you say, 'Poor Paul is dead. Poor Paul is dead.'" I could hear every word you said, but couldn't answer. I had a collapsed lung and a body full of cast iron. Paul and his wife came up that fall to the annual reunion of the 164th Infantry. Needless to say, we have corresponded ever since. What a wonderful surprise. After returning to Guadalcanal a few years ago, courtesy of the Colorado Air National Guard, we found the area of Point Cruz completely taken over by the capital city of Honiara. Point Cruz had expanded from a swamp to an industrial area, but mullet still swarmed along the beaches as in the old days. Everything had changed except the hills, which were now covered with roads and homes everywhere. Walking Red Beach, our old landing area, we found a 60 mm mortar shell, a live one, badly corroded, but a sign of past years. Along the coastal roads were at least 2,000 automobiles, all Japanese-made. There was even a traffic light at the crossroad just off the edge of Point Cruz. A new pill is available for malaria control, taken only once a week. While at the Mandana Hotel, we saw not a single mosquito. Things have changed dramatically, with prices for everything astronomical. Landing 6 miles north of Dumaguete, Negros, George Dick Hamer, standing on a new fighter with an inline engine, at Tsugi Airport, Japan. Sunken Japanese transport, Guadalcanal. Hamer and Gossett beside an anti-aircraft gun, Guadalcanal. Walker at Camp Samambula, Fiji. Walker with a 7.7 mm Nambu. Dumaguete Theatre converted to a hospital. Dumaguete Airfield with J3 strip at an angle. This field was mined, and when a P-38 pilot landed to see a buddy, his plane was destroyed. Walker with a Japanese 150 mm gun at Guadalcanal. Walker at Cape Esperance, Solomon Islands, in front of a Kinugasa Maru lifeboat. Philippine landscape behind Cebu City, Cebu. Airstrike on Negros, inland from Dumaguete about 12 miles. Pete Sherrar, Walker and Harry Mork at Bougainville. Dumaguete Landing, Negros, south of Japanese airfield. Easy officer homes for a year in Bougainville. From the Avenging Second, left to right, Lieutenant Roche, Lieutenant Sherrar, Lieutenant Landek, Captain Walker, Lieutenant Shed, and Lieutenant Ross. 1. Note: Lieutenant Shed became Reconnaissance Officer Shed on September 5, 1945, when Lieutenant Pete Sherrar was finally returned to his duties with Easy Company. 2. Author's note: This seems to substantiate my thought that this was part of the same group of enemy we hit as we had killed 14. 3. Author's note: This surplus of stakes never reached down to our battalion or company, showing that the gravy train stopped at the top with the non-combatants. The staff naturally kept the best for themselves. 4. It's a small world since I later met Mark Fairs at Command and General Staff College, Leavenworth, Kansas, in 1948, when I attended the G3 training course. We were roommates with 5 other officers, all good friends. 5. Author's note: Kingston was CO of Easy at the time. Walker, although still a captain, was battalion exec. Lieutenant Charles Ross took over as CO of Easy after Company E returned to the island of Cebu.